So questions for Kate?
I was wondering if you could say like a little bit more about the participatory aspect of your methods. I get through conversation, but could you say more about it? It sounds really interesting.
Yeah, I guess, yes, I mean, some of the interactions that I chose to have with people were through workshops and through facilitating or just participating in workshops. But I also thought that, it's a very informal movement and sort of formal research methods like semi-structured interviews or, this kind of thing, it's just a bit out of place within movements. So I thought a conversation would be an interesting way just to start unpacking people's opinions, and of course it meant that I learned about the movements that I was studying, but also I could ask, in a way, slightly probing questions about what do you think of power, how does power work, and to get different people's opinions on issues which are important, and to get a better understanding of what was going on in the movement as a whole.
Other questions?
Well, I'm just curious, when do people know that you were having these conversations in order to go into your research, or were you just having the conversations?
Well, pretty much. At the beginning of meetings, I told people that I was doing research, and when I had involvement with movements, they know that my research is ethnographic, so it's not exactly like this conversation I'm going to note down, and it's not as specific as that either, but it's kind of like maybe the impression that I get is quite, impressionistic. The impression that I get from a conversation with someone then informs my opinion, rather than it being directly that everyone said this and this and this. It's kind of like the impression, what you're saying.
Yeah, no, I really like the idea of you using these conversations to sort of take you, in the direction that the group is at one point, rather than you leading it, it's leading your research. I think that's very interesting.
More questions?
Yeah.
If not, keep thinking about them, and there will be that discussion soon. So. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So yeah. Okay.
I know. I was just wondering, the degree to get, if these are movements that you're participating in, how your position in the movement has affected your conducting of the research. So if that's not.
My position in the movement.
So if you're saying in the interview, your interviewee's perception of your politics on a particular issue, your understanding of that you might have chipped in a meeting about, I think so-and-so about horizontal organising, and so how that kind of plays into their responses.
Yeah, I mean, I guess maybe there's a certain amount of people feeling that there's, it's obviously that people are doing direct action on the ground. There's obviously a certain amount of feeling that anything that's too attached with the academy or theory is going to be detached from movement. So I guess it's like I'm trying to bring the two together in a way that's engaged. Also issues of, it's like I'm trying to overcome oppressions within movements, and yet, it's like there's hypocrisies within that, because I'm doing a funded, I've got a funded PhD to do that, and that has hypocrisies in itself, but then, it's like, so it makes me more aware of my privilege, also more aware of the ways that I have oppression. I'm also a single mother, so nothing's as simple as that, and I think, it's just been quite interesting to reflect on my own and to encourage other people to reflect on the way they fit within these kind of matrices of privilege and oppression within movements and within society as a whole.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Kate, for that. And there'll be more time for discussion. So we've got three more. You guys and myself. I mean, anyone want to go next?
I don't know if John arrived.
Would you like to summarise your research? Yeah. Okay, great. So, so any order? Okay, great. So, 5 minutes as ever. I'll keep counting and I'll do funny faces when we get to 5.
So my name's Jamie. My research was being conducted before I knew it was research, so I was sort of writing things down and notes from the very start of Occupy. which then sort of became a more detailed fieldwork diary. I conducted so far about 30 interviews with people in London, largely people who have maintained involvement past the sort of eviction stage. So I'm kind of interested in the sort of trajectories of various themes and issues through a longer period, and particularly, I suppose, well, in many ways I'm looking at like some very obvious sort of aspects and dimensions of Occupy, namely the practices around occupation and taking space, the conceptions of the people around the idea of 99%, and questions of representations. But what kind of holds that all together, I think, at the moment, is an interest in the question of identity. And like I'm in sociology, and in sort of social movement studies, sociology, there's a kind of conception running for some time that as a basic background for doing collective action together, what you need is a collective identity. And there's various senses of what that is, but generally a sense of who we are, what we're against, and what the sort of field of contention between us is. And I think in some ways, Occupy from very early on kind of confounded that. And that was kind of exemplified by the hugely expansive sort of self-understanding. You had kind of Occupy X, Occupy everywhere, Occupy your mind. The world was turned into a potential site of occupation. Similarly, the idea that we are the 99% kind of, disperses the potential, that we, across all of social life, way beyond the apparent boundaries of the assembled or the organised. And so yeah, I'm kind of interested in those questions, but of course then, moments of identity do happen. Groups form, rituals develop, and certain practices come to seem necessary for the movement. And occupation, we have 99%, things like that are examples of that. So I'm kind of following various sort of more dynamic and more kind of ossifying, freezing moments of those things around the question of identity. Making some use of the all-popular Gilles Deleuze, who talks interestingly about the question of identity. How long have I got?
2.5.
Cool. Well, in that case, I'll talk for 2.5 minutes about one of those, which is, I suppose, let's say we are the 99% thing. And what you kind of have, this is to oversimplify, but kind of in my interviews, for example, you kind of have a nice division between people who talk about that as, one of my interviewees said, it names the condition of inequality. And then someone else says, it's we the people versus that 1% bastard bankers or something along those lines. And so you kind of have this tension around 99% as a kind of, the condition of inequality, like non-specific people, i.e. not an identity. And then the tendency for it to name a discrete group of people against a 1% who are in opposition to each other. And yeah, there's this guy called Paolo Gibaudo who done some really interesting work on the collective identity of the Squares movements from 2011. So he identifies a big shift, as far as he's concerned, from the kind of global justice era, alter-globalization movement's collective identity, which he characterizes as a move to popular identity, namely the identity that we are the people. He said this is very different to the kind of self-narration of identity in the alter-globalization movement, where it was much more about being a minority, a kind of rebel archipelago of like separated groups who come together, who converge on spaces. It's like dispersed minorities, exemplified by a lot of the kind of things that people like Subhram and Marcos were saying, but also by the practices of global justice movement. Cool. So yeah, that. Oh yeah, and so now it's this we the people. And in a lot of my interviews, people talk about Occupy as the voice of the people. And I think in some ways, like that's really problematic when you're 300 people in a square saying we're the people. But I won't go into it now. But I'm trying to think about some ways that there's sort of room for that to be really, a wonderful thing, and for it to be sort of legitimate. But also in that, we are the people. There's a kind of coextensivity, like a non-separation of Occupy and the 99%. Like there's no sort of distinction. Occupy is just the kind of crystallizing centre of this expansive 99%. I'm sorry I'm speaking in like wanky poetic terms, but I can't find better ways. But then, just very briefly, but then what you also get is like the subtraction of Occupy from the 99%, and this is identity. This is, Occupy London by necessity, can do certain things by becoming a group and kind of closing off in certain moments from an outside. But there are problems maybe there as well, because some of that potential from early on is changed or lost. And so in these moments, the 99% becomes, for example, the audience of Occupy. It becomes the object of outreach, like reaching out from an inside which is separate. And also, just to close, people talk about the idea that Occupy represents the 99%, which I could talk much more about, but yeah, that's...
Perfect. Thank you for that, succinct. So, yeah, just for the latecomers, what we're doing is after each presentation, we're just taking quite specific questions about the research, and then then afterwards we're going to have a more general discussion. So now, is any specific questions about the research that you've got, or any aspect of what you've heard? Yeah.
It's not exactly a question, but something interesting that I heard about the 99% thing was people talking about the biopolitical terrain of power, where the body is actually divided, and the banker and the, say, migrant worker are equally oppressed. They're all giving their same 17 hours out of 24 to capitalism. You have their family, their community divided by capitalism, have no space for family, emotional life, or any sort of spiritual thing or anything else. And I just wondered what you think of that as an idea. People saying that we are actually within ourselves, our body, our bodies and ourselves that are actually torn. A lot, fast line goes into the body because we're all being torn apart by capitalism.
Yeah. I mean, I guess the bodily aspect takes it into a very interesting but massive other terrain. But as far as that idea that, like, inherent in all of us is this sort of distinction between the 1% and 99%, I mean, that's exactly what I was trying to get at with the idea that we are the 99% as kind of a critique of capital, of the current dispensation of inequality, rather than a discrete group. You're the 1% and I'm a member of the 99% because look at my wage slip at the end of the month. And that's also like that's a very like Marxist idea. Like later, a lot of readers of Marx will distinguish between the working class and proletarians as people in a particular social position, and there's a lot in that, especially in the early Marx, and the bourgeoisie as individuals who obviously exploit them because of a particular economic order. But also, like, Marx is interested in the proletariat as like the immanent critique of capital within capitalism. It's a tension and a contradiction rather than a group of people. And so he's very into the idea that like we're all oppressed by capital, even the bosses. Like and when he's into his early stuff on like alienation, he talks about the alienation of bosses too. But as far as the more like bodily side of it, I guess I haven't really thought of that, which would be interesting.
There was one question from Paul. Any others now? So, Anastasia, anyone else? And then, so we'll take these two, and that'll probably be time. So, yeah, Paul first.
I'm Paul. I'm sorry I'm late. Fine. But I'm fascinated by the 99% in relation to what happened in Scotland. Because what happened in Scotland was that the young and the working age voted to be free of Westminster. And I think that is the target group for me. That group needs to get bigger. And I came reading in an article in the Standard that I came here, I found a long story about why young Muslims would rather go and fight for Al-Qaeda and ISIS. And I just wondered whether there was a connection there between the Glaswegians who actually would have gone out and been an independent Scotland, and the young and the working age people, who the leader of the Irish community, of which I'm an associate, announced that he was going to vote yes, because he no longer believed that the Westminster government was capable of governing in the interest of everybody. And I no longer believe that the Westminster government is capable of governing in the interest of everybody. And I think that is the issue. And I think our audience that must be spilled is in fact that group. Tottenham will vote for independence, I'm sure, given a chance.
Right, okay, and yeah, so, you know, at the moment we're focusing quite specifically on research, but I think towards the end it'd be great to open the discussions up and maybe even take forward
is directly
ideas.
related to what we were saying.
Right,
It's more of a comment than a question.
It's a comment.
Yeah.
great, so we'll bear that in mind as well in future discussion. So final question or comment?
It's a comment, and that's actually something I mentioned to Paolo, who you mentioned in your. So it's not a challenge towards the more populist character, maybe of Occupy, but it's in the description of the global justice movement. Okay, I have a PhD. I did my PhD on the global justice movement and its use of digital media. So I'm thinking that, you know, I mean, the global justice movement was saying we are everywhere. So it's not we are the 99%, but there was an appeal that we are many and we are everywhere. So I'm not so sure that it was such a minoritarian movement, to be honest. I think that if you look at the differences, this was a movement operating on a global scale. So it had a lot of barriers when it came to participation in mass demonstrations, but it did try to open it up. So if you look at the social forum process, yes, okay, it became a very inward-looking and it excluded a lot of people, yes, of course, but the whole logic was that it was very open, decisions were, taken with participatory methods. So I'm not really sure about, the global justice movement being so minoritarian, to be honest. I mean, while I do agree with your points about Occupy, I'm not sure that comparison really stands.
Yeah, no, I mean, I presented it as if I just agree with it because I was talking for 5 minutes. I'm equally suspicious of that. It's too neat to distinguish it.
Yes, I think it's too neat.
If I looked into it more, I'd be interested if there were like sort of tendencies in a certain direction. But clearly, it's not as neat as like we were this, minority subcultural group in 2002, and now we are emerging as the people. You could do with it probably an analysis that like tease out some of that. But I'm certainly going to say to you, right, I'm suspicious of it as well.
And if you actually talk to people who are trained others to be facilitators, for instance, in New York, you see that they took those tactics from global justice as well. So, there was sort of like, there was continuity there.
You plot those roots from global justice into most of the kind of West European occupiers in the US.
Awesome, so yeah, we'll have to cut that discussion there, but again, maybe pick it up again. So thanks for bringing that up. So we've got 3 of us left to speak. Any particular order? What we're going? So we've got maximum 5 minutes and then questions. Any preference, guys?
How many of us are actually presented?
So there's 3 more now,
There's been 3.
and we've had 3.
Right, so as if everybody's presenting.
So do you want to go in next?
Okay, yes.
Sorry, or were you getting ready to launch into it now?
You wanted me to go first?
Okay, go for it then. Okay, sorry, I missed the conversation. Okay, so just introduce who you are, and I'm timing you for 5 minutes. I'm being quite strict, so apologies when I growl as you get nearer to 5 minutes.
Right, you're going to cut me off after 5 minutes.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm just starting the 2nd year of my PhD at the University of East London in deliberative democracies in global justice movements, an ethno-methodological approach. So I'll briefly outline my positions on global justice movements, deliberative democracies and ethno-methodologies. I must say I'm at the 2nd year of a part-time PhD. I haven't done any research yet. I'm just doing a literature review and an introduction to it. So global justice movement, and it's the tin, are movements for global justice. I usually take this as meaning economic as opposed to political justice. So neoliberalism might belong in political justice, such as freedom of speech and freedoms to vote. Can you hear me at the back? Okay. Global justice then is long on the economic justice required to exercise these freedoms, such as the right to work and in particular the right to a citizen's income. Some of you may remember a debate on the Occupy Forum about the role of the consensus. And I suggested there, anybody remember that? Oh, you do? That's very good. I thought you might, I argued the role of a consensus depended on the type of struggle being conducted by the social movement, identifying economic, political and ideological struggles, and suggesting the role of a consensus was most suited to an ideological type of struggle. So social and global justice movements can be distinguished from political parties by their flexibilities and recognitions of these different types of struggles. Right, so when I first got involved in Occupy, I'm going to go on to deliberative democracies now. We're now entering the third minute. So the website contained an interesting explanation of how Occupy's system of democracy was supposed to work. So Occupy didn't do any voting. Majorities debated things with minorities until a consensus was arrived at, based on the least unpopular rather than the most popular outcomes. So from this point of view, it's a bit like a preference voting system rather than a first past the post system. This type of democracy then attempts to arrive at good decisions rather than majority decisions. So that's why I've called it a qualitative democracy, or as the political theorists call it, a deliberative democracy. So these political theories are very often concerned with the poor quality of modern democracies. Now, there were, from the 50s, people, I'm going to summarise this because I've written a lot more than enough time today, so if you're going to cut me off after 5 minutes. So somebody like Schumpeter or Downes from the 1950s, problems of one, consumerism and people being more interested in economics than politics, and also the poor quality of neoliberal democracies, which we're probably well familiar with. So that type of thing was picked up by theorists such as John Rawls or Jürgen Habermas. Habermas in particular was well known for promoting the idea of a public sphere, of public debate, which had been much diminished under neoliberalism. So Habermas tended to suggest some of this could be achieved through a rational debate, much as the Occupy website had suggested. Other writers picked up, I did not suggest that, you can ask me afterwards. Yes, so Iris Marion Young pointed out the limitations to the type of rationality promoted by Habermas, suggesting it excluded the rationalities of ethnic minorities and other disadvantaged communities. Chantal Mouffe pointed out the limits to the extent to which a consensus could be arrived at, suggesting there'd always be some sort of antagonism between ideas, the one of which can't be demonstrated to be better than the other. And she picks up especially the antagonism between freedoms and equalities, which can't be settled in advance, but there's always going to be some sort of debate about it. The problem is that multinational companies don't really want to debate these things with us. And studies of deliberative democracies are not too easily generated into studies of consultation exercises, such as citizens' juries about the details of neoliberalism. So I found the ideas of Habermas and Mouffe most useful in studying organisations which set out to have members of an equal status, such as global justice movements, which I talked about earlier. Donatella Della Porta is a pioneering writer, 30 seconds, pioneering writer about deliberative democracies in global justice movements, having done some work on the European Social Forum in the 2000s. And from a more radical point of view, Jeffrey Juris and Alex Kasnovich have pioneered the ethnographic study of social movements, something which I'm just getting into now. We're just about out of time. I've still got ethnomethodologists to do if you're interested, but you're probably not, so we'll leave it at that, shall we?
Unless you can summarise it in one sentence.
I'll ask you.
Okay.
You would ask me,
What is ethnomethodology?
all right, we're going to... Well, I've got it. Hang on, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 paragraphs.
Can I answer the questions and then go? Sorry? Should I answer the questions?
It's about 6 questions about ethnomethodology, and we'll do it. So, okay, well, do you want me to go...
In a nutshell?
Can't you summarise
Okay,
ethnomethodology?
well, let me just do it in a nutshell. Right, what I've said here, I'm doing this method, yeah. A sociological tradition which sees societies as being built up from the bottom through a series of social interactions. The pioneering figure in this approach is Alan Garfunkel, not to be confused with Art Garfunkel. A particularly influential area has been conversation analysis, associated with figures such as Harvey Sachs, Emmanuel Shegloff, Gail Jefferson. So I was going to develop some ethnomethodological criticisms of Juris and Kasnovich. So should we leave that to the next question?
Great.
We'll do that.
I'm planning that question.
Do idealist methodologies and Marxist materialist analysis go together? academic
I
question.
do, but I'm so long we've got to talk about that. I've got to talk about that for about 20 pages.
Let's also open up, because there might, has anyone got any, I mean, we can carry on questions about this, but the ethno, but is there anyone who's got any other specific questions about the research? Anyone else? We can, yeah.
I guess, yeah, so at what stage have you been involved with this? And at what stage have you your field work started? So, speak up. Sorry.
It's like I'm here now.
To what extent have you been involved with movements already, and when your field work will start? And also I was interested in consensus. I don't know, yeah. I mean, it's certainly like, I think, you know, it's like consensus is about having a wide range of opinions, and I don't know, I'm not exactly sure if you're comparing it to majority and minority. Maybe you need to look a bit more at it, or actually maybe what I think is once you start doing the ethnographic part of the field work, it'll become a bit clearer what consensus is like in action. It's complicated, and it's quite, you know, it's a process of deliberation, isn't it? It's a process of disagreement, kind of, it's like it's disagreement and living and coming together with what you can, and then moving forward.
Right, and if we keep speaking up, because it's getting louder noise. Sorry, have you?
So, how I've been involved with the movement? So I've been with Occupy since about 2013. I haven't done a lot with them. I've been to, you know, paper meetings. I've been to the Economics Working Group. Occasionally we're there sort of looking at alternative ways of running economies, which is my most interesting part of it, looking at different ways of running societies. Also, I've been interested in global justice movements as democracies, the sort of thing I'm looking at here. Now, I haven't done a lot of activism, like going out picketing fracking sites or anything like that, no. So, I don't know where that leaves me, I mean, whether that's a problem. But I've only got, I mean, I do about 4 hours a week of it. No, you know, but I'm doing a PhD and various other things in my time. It's not a way of life to me, is it to some people? No.
Yes? I guess it's just the ethnographic part of the methodology make me think that you might be going and spending time with different groups, organising, but yeah,
And so sorry, we're just coming up to 5 minutes, so I don't mean to be rude again. Maybe if you could quickly finish it. Were there any other questions as well? Because I wanted to squeeze you in. Do you want to just have a final comment then, or response to that?
Yes, this ethnographic research, well, I haven't done a lot of that at the moment. I know a lot of people have been to fracking sites and camps and that sort of thing. I've done ethnographic research. Now, possibly, I don't know. Well, if you're asking me when I'm going to do it, I'm in the second year of this part-time PhD at the moment. I'm going to do a literature review in the next year to 2015. The field work won't come until at least then, and I don't know much about it at the moment. I'm just doing some research methods course. They just asked me what I'm studying, so we'll go into that. Is that it? That's 5 minutes. I mean,
yeah, I'm sorry about this, but you know, we're trying to get a balance of more people, and so if we keep all speaking up, then hopefully we'll manage to hear each other. Is anyone really struggling to hear?
Off and on.
Off and on. When I'm like the volume I'm speaking at now, is that better? Okay. So if Anastasia then questions, if we all try and boom as much as we can, we'd appreciate it. Do you want to go now?
Yeah.
No, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, you can hear me on that volume, right?
Just about.
Just about. Okay, so I'll shout a little bit more.
It's partly, I mean, it sounds so rude, partly because you have an accent, so...
Yeah, well, I know. I'm Greek. I'm Greek origin, if you're wondering what this accent comes from. Strange accent. 13 years here, accent still here. Okay, so I'm in the media department. So my work focuses much more on digital media and the digital media practices of Occupy. Now, I wasn't a very active participant in Occupy London. I just went to some of the meetings. I was mostly a weekender, you could say. But I've been involved in social movements for a very long time, so maybe 20 years now. So this past year, I got some money from the British Academy to do research, so I didn't have to teach, which was great. I had some money to go to the USA, so I went to different cities. I went to Seattle, I went to New York, and I went to Boston, and I also have some interviews from the UK, from London. So I have about 75 interviews with activists. Jamie was my first interview before I actually started the project. I don't know.
I'm joking.
Mark is one of my interviews as well, and you know I still owe them transcripts. So I wasn't doing ethnographic work. It was very clear that I was coming into that as a researcher with some history in activism. But the interviews were much more like a conversation, so they were unstructured. Many of them lasted 2.5 to 3 hours. Mark can testify to that. So there's a transcript of 50 pages to send in. So because I was trying to understand not only digital, what was going on with digital media, and that includes not only social media, because I know that's very trendy, but also email lists, websites, blogs, but also in relation to practices and what was going on offline in the squares. So the approach that I'm taking to this is I'm trying to put communication at a very central position theoretically, and there aren't many theoretical frameworks that actually help you do that. So I am also trying to sort of like think theoretically about how this works, because my idea is that in order to have any sort of a collective, we need to communicate. And the way we communicate shapes the types of collectives that we have. So if we're thinking of prefigurative politics and what sort of collectives we want to create, thinking about communication and our communication practices is very important. So I'm thinking of communication both in terms of conversations, but also in terms of texts that tend to crystallize what is going on in the different conversations. And then, because I'm looking at digital media, I'm not looking only at what's going on in offline conversations, face-to-face, but I'm also looking at the types of conversations that people are having online and the different spaces where that happens, right? So, I mean, social movements do not really have a membership list. If you think of who is occupying, many people actually ask this question in some of my interviews, and many people think of the square. They talk about the square. So they think of sort of like different spaces where people communicate, right? So when you think of the origins of a movement, what happens first is that people carve out communication spaces both online and offline. So for Occupy London, it was the creation of a Facebook group, and then face-to-face meetings in order to plan the occupation, and then the occupation itself, so another conversation site where people could come together. So I'm thinking then that those conversation sites and thinking about them, thinking the types of conversation that took place over there, the texts that were created, also allows us to understand the power relations within the movement as well. Because if we've been part of movements, even movements that want to be non-hierarchical, we all know that they are. That power relations do exist, and we have to. So the questions I think that we need to be asking is not really who has more power than others, but we need to be asking more questions like, is that power legitimate? Which are the processes through which this power becomes legitimated? 1 minute. Is there mobility between people? What sort of characteristics do people need in order to get into positions of power? And are those sort of like characteristics that are training, for instance, so that more people, that's how it will be sort of like allocated. So we can think of for instance, the power dynamics between the people who have access to the square and the people who just were following things online. And we see that, most of the decisions that, the occupations were actually at the core of the movement. And all of the others, for instance, the people who were participating via social media, were really mostly bystanders, So in 30 seconds, we can think of different types of power. So these are the power of the people who can create the people who can create the common texts and the common statements, for instance, of movement, but also the people who can actually create and carve out space for conversations. So the people who can occupy squares, the people who can create Facebook pages, because then we have another type of power, which is the power to manage those spaces, right? So you can think of the power of Facebook administrators, for instance, of the administrators of websites, but also of the facilitators of the conversations and the meetings that are happening face-to-face. So that's another type of power. There's a third type of power that has to do with access. So who has access to what side, right? And what sort of participation happens in which side, you know. And the fourth one has to do with linking. So who has the power to network those different sides, but also to network with targets, with journalists? Who has the power to actually connect the movement with the wider public? So these are other questions. So we can think of live streamers, for example, as having that sort of power, being able to connect the offline with the people watching online. And the fifth type of power, before you start, is the power of representation. So who has the power to actually speak in the voice of the movement? Who has the power to tweet as Occupy?
Thank you.
It. Okay.
Awesome. Okay, thanks. So, direct questions about the research, anything specific? So, Paul and then Liz, yeah?
You talked about texts. I'm wondering if also these sort of assemblages of camps, the materiality of the camps, the objects, the placards, whether you're studying those, whether the configuration of sites are also texts that you read rather than just what people say, because I think the unconscious, the way things are organised without anyone consciously being making decisions, is also serious clues to what's actually going on in society, not just social media.
That's a very interesting question, and because my focus is mainly digital media, but in order to understand digital media, I think we need to understand what is going on in the other spaces. But yes, this is exactly how I'm thinking of the movement, as an assemblage of those different sides and those different types. So you can think of materiality, but also you can think of the ownership of spaces. So when it comes to digital media, we really need to think of the ownership of our digital infrastructures. Are these infrastructures that we have created? Are they spaces that we have carved out on Facebook and actually managed and owned by Facebook? So ownership is extremely important here, and that goes back to that sort of materiality.
Right, let's keep speaking up, and I saw two other questions here. So Liz, I think was first.
Well, firstly, I'd like to say is brilliant. You hit on a topic that's hot topic in Occupy at the moment, which is how we communicate to the media and how we manage the website and Twitter and Facebook. So, absolutely apropos. The thing I was actually going to ask you was, how is this research going to be disseminated? Are you disseminating it via digital?
Yeah. I'm actually writing up some papers now. I do have a blog that I'm not really advertising that much because I'm now working through my transcripts, and I find that I cannot write at the same time, but I will be writing much more, and it will be a much better blog than it is at the moment. It's called digitalprotest.net. So there is some.
It will be available.
So it will be available as a blog. All of the papers, the first drafts, will be available on the blog. And I would like to write a book out of this, and I'd like for the book to be actually available online. So I'm looking for a publisher who will actually make it available.
I should crowdfund.
That would be another area.
So, yeah, and speak up, please, everyone.
I've completed this.
I've completed the field mostly. Yeah, I've completed the field, but I'm writing up. So
Digital media. I mean Facebook, that's what How do you mean by digital media? Is that Facebook? That's like Facebook.
no, it's not only Facebook. So through the interviews, I'm asking people about their use of internet and emails, and I think emails are equally important. I think that everybody knows what to use social media because it's the new and trending thing. Social media are very important for communicating with the public, or communicating with it's very important. But I think when it comes to internal communication, emails are extremely important.
Digital media.
Digital media, I'm talking about the internet.
Just the internet.
Yeah, the internet.
Well, just the internet. We just mentioned social media. We mentioned emails. We mentioned websites, and it's still a lot.
Right, so by digital media, you mean all of those?
Yeah.
Okay, any final quick questions? Final quick questions? Okay, so we're going to keep trying to bear through. It's just me left to speak, so I'll boom it out. And then hopefully we'll have about half an hour to chat. And if it gets, we can always move if it's... There's a concert starting in 10 minutes. I don't know if that's good or bad. It might mean that it's quiet and they shut the doors, but it might mean there's some bass coming out. Okay, so I'm going to try and summarise I've spent the last 3 years of my life researching Occupy London. I'm going to summarise it in 5 minutes, so that's a bit of a challenge. And I'm actually going to try and talk about like concrete findings and conclusions, which academics never talk about, but I think it's kind of useful when you're speaking to movers. And this is what I found out. So I'm going to oversimplify and generalise like way too much, so just bear with me. So 3 quick points is all I'm going to make. So firstly, I got involved in Occupy London first of all as an activist. I went down on the 15th of October, I got really involved. That was kind of what I was spending my life doing. I just started a PhD, and about a couple of months in, I was like, heck, I better study this because I'm spending all my life down here. So what I did is what's commonly called militant research, which is my focus was trying to struggle with and alongside Occupy London. That was my political focus, and I thought, can research help that? And I thought, well, maybe as someone who's involved, who's got some time to think about it, I can help movements reflect on what they're doing. So, second point, my kind of overall argument to start with is that I'm a geographer. We've talked a bit about this kind of potential contrast from the older globalization movements of past and Occupy. So to way oversimplify the way I saw it is that geographers have said that in the last 15, 20 years, the most important thing for movements is networks, especially like international, transnational networks. The World Social Forum, and these kinds of things. It's all about networks. Whereas in Occupy, networks are very important, but I also thought there's something else going on, which is what I understand through territoriality, but basically being grounded in particular places. Yeah, and this is not to say that you have one or the other, but this is something that has been quite overlooked by geographers, so this was my starting point. So what I'm going to speak for the next 2.5 minutes is saying, this was what I went out. I went out to try and understand Occupy from the perspective of that it's a movement grounded in place. Great, so what? Who cares? Why is that useful? Well, having spent the kind of year heavily involved in Occupy and then interviewing some of you guys and about 43 others, I thought we can think about Occupy in terms of 4 main sets of practices. Because, you know, we're a movement, we do stuff, and the 4 practices are relating to this idea of occupying space. So the first one's taking space, right? You speak to any activist, they talk about, we're going to take a space tomorrow, we took a space. And I said, what can we think about in taking space? And my main conclusion was that when Occupy took space, there was a tension between, on the one hand, taking space for this big moment of wow, whoa, rupture, explosion, which is like, people talked about it as this whirlwind of time. And this was this really exciting, like, carnival, like, explosion of some new other world. But on the other hand, lots of people talk to me, and it's very clear that you also need to eat, sleep, drink, go to the toilet, and have these more gentle rhythms of everyday life. And like, this was like really apparent when I spoke to people in like welfare and other groups. They said, look, lots of people didn't find it revolutionary enough. They wanted the big wow, boom. That's why they took space. They forgot that taking space is also living and sleeping. And I suggested that Finsbury Square St Paul's was a demonstration of that. So Finsbury Square became a space of more chilling out and this everyday life, where St Paul's was all about the big boom, wow, rupture. That was one tension that existed in Occupy. Second one, I said that it was also a space of encountering. You meet people, you talk about, you discuss, you deliberate. So one space of this encountering was the GA, and that was the most prominent space. It was like the GA. Wow, GA is amazing, and it was good. But I also realised that people talked to me a lot about all the other encounters they had on the protest camp, which weren't confined to the space of the GA. And of course, people had many problems with the GA. After about a few weeks, it became sometimes unbearable. And I suggested there was a tension between having a space of encounter in the quite institutional GA and just on the protest camp, where you could chat to people in suits, the 1%, so to speak, other occupiers, activists, families. And then there was a kind of a tension between the institutionalization of the GA and the camp. Third main practice was holding space. So you speak to activists, they say, well, once you've taken the space, what's the next challenge? To hold it. How are we going to hold the space? Now, unlike a lot of other movements elsewhere where the police came down, although they did come down on the first night, holding space, the issue wasn't defending ourselves from the police. That was never really the main issue, coming in with batons and tear gas. The main issue was internally tearing ourselves apart in a number of different ways. Now, I looked at the relationship between Occupy and, well, St Paul's slightly, but mainly in the court case.
30 seconds.
Yeah. Thanks. Thank you. I said that basically the main problem was internal tensions about the different hierarchies growing on camp. That was the holding space issue. Finally then, the last practice was then losing space. You take the space, you hold it and you lose it. And I said that what happened is during the occupation, people tend to fetishize the protest camp. All they could see was the protest camp. When I interviewed them afterwards, they said, no, the camp was only ever attacked. It occupies much bigger than that. So what happens is you've got a tension between, in this territoriality, this tension between the particular place of the protest camp, or a squat, or whatever it is, and the movement as a whole. You need to occupy these spaces, but you've got to realise the limitations. And I suggested that maybe it's helpful, instead of worrying about losing space, you should be happy about leaving space, and that should be a focus from the start. Know you're going to leave, and leave. They were the main tensions and the kind of issues that I found, which I've vastly simplified to try and get it across. I'll reset for 5 minutes and take any questions about that. I know there was quite a lot then.
Just want to know what you were originally going to do your PhD on.
The anti-cuts movement in the UK. The geography of the anti-cuts movement. The anti-cuts movement.
So it wasn't a million miles away.
I'm a geographer. When Occupy happened, it was like, you know, coming from on a plane. Yeah.
I spent most of the Royal Geographical Society conference asking things like this, but how does the anti-cuts movement have a geography?
So very simply, I mean, this is just to cut a long story short, I was suggesting that space is really important to movements for a lot of things. You need spaces in which to organise, you need to produce spaces to do stuff. And that the globalisation movement is a very simple story. People have done a lot of work on networks. We talked a bit about practices of networking. And what's important is you've got to build networks, reach out, go to different places, go online. And they were forgetting about the importance of these territorial practices, of taking spaces. People hadn't really investigated them very much. So space, I think in Occupy, I don't really need to answer why geography is important. I would suggest that space is quite clearly defining. You couldn't imagine Occupy without thinking about space, I'd suggest.
No, I mean, see, when I was at this, there's some things. The last time I did in geography was in the second year of secondary school, and we didn't talk about social movements then. Now, if you do enough geography, you'll realise that there's something to do with space here, which I don't easily realise. But if I did, then I might see this. Rather than me asking you that here.
Cool. So I'm happy to chat about geography afterwards. I don't want to bore everyone here with the history of academic geography. But
I don't know geography's here. I don't know.
I had to write
another question. Yeah.
Sorry, in my geography, I had to write an essay. What's most important you find in space? And I said time. And I knew that was my first essay. Space is the most funny achievement. Yeah.
Okay.
I'm interested in the tension between. We spoke about the tension between chaos and order within spaces, and sort of like that. It's interesting how power plays, but dynamics that go on, and how do you see things in those terms as well when you talk about the institutionalisation of GA and the random encounter kind of it's like a balance between chaos and order almost. Obviously some people feel more comfortable in some encounters and others in others, but did you feel that as well, that there was that tension?
So the chaos and order aren't like, it wasn't the terminology that I use, and I'm not sure that would fit necessarily onto this, so the institution is a word that I found more helpful, becoming institutionalized into a very particular set way of doing practices, within which there was quite a lot of chaos in the GA. Trying to break through that institution, continuously. But maybe that's another way of thinking about it. For me, it was this question of becoming institutionalized. And one of the ways was through the GA, but the main way was through the space itself. For me, protest camp became an institution, and people couldn't see beyond it. It was like, we hold the space. Now, I think people are still debating, does Occupy need to have a protest camp or another space? And my suggestion was that it needs spaces, but then also it doesn't, and that's a perennial tension. You're always going to be trapped against and beyond those spaces, but without space, you can't live. And there's a fundamental need to have space in which just to survive. but then also to create. And I didn't have much time to talk about all the amazing good stuff that Occupy did do, and I think that was mainly creating new social relations and new values in those spaces, right? That's what happened. People met each other, they had great experience, but they were creating new social relations and new values which potentially sit uncomfortably with capitalism. We haven't really got into this debate about the merits of capitalism that I suggested, but I think that there was an antagonism with capitalism, but again it was an internal thing going on in the camp. So, 1 more minute, so any final... Yeah.
How did you understand space? The physical space?
Yeah. So I don't think, for me, like as a geographer or whatever, you can't really separate physical without the immaterial and imaginary space, right? Because it's something that exists in your mind, in your imagination. You also represent it online and offline. But the materiality was essential. Without that materiality of the space, the occupation couldn't happen. You couldn't imagine the movement. And in the case of the GA, for example, I looked very little about sort of online participation. It was quite clear that although that happened, people tried to block stuff occasionally. I remember someone on live stream saying, "I'm blocking," and someone saying, "You can't." They sat on their laptop somewhere. So there was very much a strong weighting towards the materiality. But these sort of debates on the physical versus non went a bit beyond my remit. But it's material and immaterial, but the material is definitive. Right, okay. So I switch off my presenter's hat and go back into
I'm called Sam.
facilitator hat, and we've got half an hour to mull over and chat. And just to lead into it, the sort of questions that was useful and interesting to me, and also I think the history of the Occupy Research Collective that some of us here have been involved in, is what the hell kind of use is this research? Are we just getting paid money to live? Maybe that's it. Or is it actually useful politically? And if it is useful, how can we make it more useful? And I thought perhaps that question of dissemination is really useful. I mean, I've tried to send everything I published to the Occupy Rise Up list, but I think there's a lot more that can be done. We've talked about using the Occupy Research Collective website as a repository for any research to be made freely available. You put it on that blog. But there's lots of other questions we could discuss, like the ethics of research, or we could get away from research questions and talk about some of these more specific debates. But we've got half an hour, so maybe I'll just throw it open. And any comments or thoughts generally. So we'll take. I've got two points. Do you want to go first, and then we'll come back to yourself?
If it's going to be useful politically, who is it going to be useful for?
Good question. Is that an open question? So do you want to have your point afterwards, or do you want to address that first?
We should probably address it, seeing as it's there, I suppose.
Okay, so we've got you on hold.
I was going to ask something else, see, so if I just talk now, it will get lost, won't it?
I don't think it can be useful for 99%. That's my problem. I mean, how did we arrive at 99%? It came out of the great campaigning message. Actually, I don't think it's very realistic politically. But we don't want to talk about it.
Well, I think my own feeling is it would be useful that I've talked to a number of people who get in touch because they live wherever they live and they've got a problem. It might be a supermarket opening that they want to oppose, and they want some information about how to organise. And one of the things I've considered is the idea of a book, how to run a revolution or something equally, which gives people just very basic ideas of how you might organise a protest and stuff. Well, I don't even like the word a demonstration of your difficulty with something that's being proposed in your community. And I think some of this research can be helpful to people who organising in that way. And I think therefore going online would certainly help me a lot if I could say to people, go to this link and pick out, cherry pick what you want out of the information you find.
So we'll put your question on hold, but yeah, Judith?
With the last politics. I am a member of the International Society of City and Regional Planners, and they're organizing a congress next year for their 50th anniversary. And the innovative bit is usually to run it in one hall for 5 days and people are giving papers endlessly and they're playing on their phones. Absolutely boring. And so I am General Rapporteur, so I have a little say on the content. And the local organizing committee is very much against this monumentally boring way of doing things, just to satisfy the academics to travel and say the same stuff again and again. So there is no dissemination, there is no communication, none. So what they do is they start with 12 cities, and each city has got its own theme. And my critique about the themes which they have chosen, has to do with planning, of course, with space in that sense, was that the social was a bit weak. And they have now changed this. Well, this is sort of, we do it as well. And I said, some of the cities have to have that in the focus. Now there are 3 of them, Eindhoven, Antwerp, and Brussels. And they have decided that they were starting with that. And that's where you come in. Because I think one way of disseminating this position to say there is the 99% thinks differently is you have to not remain in the 99%. You have to address the 1% which will be there. The mayors, the VIPs, some gurus who are being invited to give speeches. So I would like to keep you informed about that. And they are very keen that the young people are very active in that. So they have already engaged young people from all over the world to actually sharpen up these themes and run them as workshops, action on, exchange and so forth, instead of reading papers. I'm just against that. And this is very exciting, in fact. And they have created a website already, and it's open, so anyone can contribute and make comments and so on. And the cities have started to put forward their ideas of what they want to do. So please be active in that, and please come along. So I will send to Sam some summary of that stuff, of where it's going. And I would very much, really, I would welcome it. And also, because I'm General Rapporteur, I will need some rapporteurs for each of the city to feed back of what is happening there, because I can't cut myself into 12. And therefore, there will be a call for that, and I will tip you off about it, so that people can apply. And I think that, so the more the merrier. I think that would be really great. So it's not going to be academic discussion about methodology, blah, 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 blah. None of that is. What can you do with the stuff I have found out or I'm preoccupied with, and so on. And so it's very, very practical. It's very much addressing your question. So there's a practical opportunity. It's all over the Netherlands, and some in Belgium and some in Germany.
And just to say then, so we've got this Occupy Research Collective email discussion list, so all these kind of conversations happening today, just you're welcome to join that list. You can just ask me and I'll join you if you're not on it. And that's the sort of forum maybe we can use to keep this forward. So we had this question about who can this stuff be useful for. I don't know if we want to stay on that, and I know there's a separate question. So is this on the who is it useful? And then we'll,
Right, so how does ethno-methodology relate to social movements? So if we're going to have a horizontal democracy, then power is going to be shifted from the economics and politics to social interaction, a power of persuasion, a power of ideas. Yeah? So I'm interested in how general assemblies work, how working group meetings work, who sets the agenda, who does the talking, who doesn't say anything, how the meeting's structured. Well, that's very similar to what you were doing, isn't it? So this is how there'll still be power structures, as you said. So that's what I'm investigating, and what we're investigating with this research. How do we make these horizontal democracies work? Is that fair enough? Is that the sort of thing it's for? Is that the sort of thing it's for me?
Any more points then? Thank you. Following on from that on this question of who, and then we'll move on to the next questions. Yeah?
Just sort of a personal thing, like some of the most useful stuff I've been reading lately has been, I think, where, so to name a few people, one of them Starhawk from the States, another one's Chris Crass from the States. In fact, I haven't been reading anyone from the UK, it's a bit of a weird one. Like
better get that stuff out there.
And what these people have done to summarise is kind of thought very much on these questions, the type of questions you guys are raising. I think they're really important questions to introduce to people, not necessarily, I think the questions are a little bit more important than the answers, to be honest. I'm thinking of people who want to participate in movements and want to make them work and so on, large numbers of people, or hardcore committed organisers, whatever. These people like Chris Crass and Starhawk have been thinking, I think, deeply on a lot of these themes and questions you guys are talking about, but then relating it to very personal experiences they had on the ground, which maybe you could use with your interviews and so on. But to me, the question of who is it useful for and how is it useful is to provide people who are engaged in movement activity with as much accessible as much accessible material that is reflective. It's looking at what's gone before and said, okay, these are some of the insights or some of the questions or some of the themes that you can draw from it. So if that can be presented in an accessible way, in a way that is not too jargonistic and is, and all that kind of stuff, I think it's useful. Although I do think there's a certain kind of cyclical nature to these sort of themes and questions, and they just kind of arise again and again and again. So it's like, it's how usefully they can be transmitted to people in a context. So I suppose my point is that it should be accessible, and it should be, I think the personalized theme of it, people's personal experiences, is quite valuable. Yeah, waffle on as well.
Awesome, thanks. So any more on this? Who can research be useful for? And then we'll go. Or weave your question into this discussion.